The funeral was for someone Jolene Pryor barely knew, a church elder named Harold Combs, who had apparently sung bass in the choir for 41 years and never missed a Wednesday service. Jolene stood in the back row of Calvary Fellowship in Meridian, Mississippi, wearing a borrowed black dress, because her mother had called that morning and said, "Harold's people don't have enough bodies to fill the pews, and that man deserves a full house." Jolene's mother, Willa Pryor, measured loyalty in attendance. You showed up. That was the currency. It was October 2016. Jolene was 39. She had not set foot in Calvary Fellowship since her sister Nadine's wedding 27 years earlier, and returning now felt like walking through someone else's memory. The carpet had been replaced. The hymnals had been updated. But the wooden cross above the baptismal pool was the same one Nadine had stood beneath in a white dress on September 16, 1989, holding the arm of a man named Dale Burkhart, smiling in a way that Jolene, 11 years old at the time, had believed was permanent. After the service, the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall. Jolene poured coffee and listened to stories about Harold Combs and tried to leave early, but her mother intercepted her near the kitchen. Willa had something to show her. A woman from the church media committee, Patrice Sheldon, had been digitizing old VHS tapes from church events, baptisms, holiday programs, potlucks, choir recitals. She had transferred dozens of them to DVD and was playing a selection on a television in the corner of the hall so people could see Harold in his younger days. Jolene stood beside her mother and watched clips of Christmas pageants and homecoming dinners. And then a segment began that was labeled Fall Revival 1992. The footage showed the interior of the sanctuary during an evening service. The camera panned across the congregation, lingering on faces singing from hymnals, and then swept toward the far left section near the side entrance. Jolene stopped breathing. In the third row from the back, partially turned away from the camera, sat a woman with dark auburn hair pulled into a low knot. She wore a navy cardigan and was holding a hymnal open with both hands. The camera passed her in approximately 4 seconds, but in the middle of those 4 seconds, the woman glanced sideways, just barely, as if checking whether someone was watching, and her face was visible for perhaps a full second and a half. Jolene grabbed her mother's arm. Willa looked at the screen and then looked away. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's Nadine," Jolene said. Willa shook her head. "You do this every time." But Jolene had not done this before. She had never once claimed to have spotted Nadine in a crowd, in a photograph, in a car, on the highway. Other families of missing people described that phenomenon constantly, the false sightings, the desperate pattern recognition. But Jolene had always been careful with herself, almost ruthlessly so. She did not see Nadine in strangers. She did not hear Nadine's voice in other women's laughter. She had spent 27 years disciplining her grief into something manageable, and that discipline had cost her more than anyone around her understood. But the woman in that church video, in that pew, holding that hymnal, she had Nadine's exact posture, the slight forward lean, the way her left hand gripped the spine of the book while her right hand rested flat against the open page. And when she turned her head, the line of her jaw was not similar. It was identical. "I need a copy of that tape," Jolene said. Willa set down her coffee. "Harold Combs just got buried, Jolene." "I know. And that's my sister sitting in this church 3 years after she vanished. Nadine Pryor married Dale Burkhart in September 1989 at Calvary Fellowship in front of 93 guests. She was 24 years old, a dental hygienist at a clinic in downtown Meridian. Dale was 28, a plasterer who worked commercial renovation jobs across Lauderdale County. They had dated for 14 months. Willa Pryor had reservations about Dale from the start, not because he was cruel or dishonest, but because he seemed to have no interior life. He answered questions with the fewest possible words. He smiled when smiling was expected. He treated Nadine attentively in public, and Willa could never determine whether that attentiveness continued when nobody was watching. The couple moved into a rented house on Scuba Road, 4 miles east of the church. Nadine continued working at the dental clinic. Dale picked up a long-term renovation contract at a commercial building in Hattiesburg, which kept him away from home 3 or 4 nights a week. By November, neighbors saw Nadine less frequently. By January 1990, her co-worker at the clinic, a woman named Bev Osborne, noticed that Nadine had stopped eating lunch in the break room and had begun wearing long sleeves even on mild days, On the morning of March 3, 1990, Dale Burkhart drove to the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office and reported that his wife had not been home when he returned from Hattiesburg the previous night. Her car, a beige 1984 Chevrolet Celebrity, was parked in the driveway. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her wallet contained $32 and her driver's license. Her keys were on the hook beside the front door. The only items Dale could confirm were missing were a small brown leather suitcase and some of her clothing. The sheriff's office classified Nadine as a voluntary missing person. Dale told the deputy that Nadine had been unhappy, that she had talked about leaving, that she had family in Mobile and might have gone there. A deputy called Willa Pryor in Meridian. Willa said Nadine had not contacted her. A second call went to Nadine's aunt in Mobile, who said the same. No further investigative action was taken for 11 days. When Willa drove to the house on Scuba Road on March 14th to look for herself, Dale met her on the porch and told her Nadine had called him 2 days earlier from a payphone and said she was fine and did not want to be found. He could not provide the number. He said the call had lasted less than a minute. Willa demanded to enter the house. Dale refused. Willa returned to the sheriff's office. The deputy noted the reported phone contact and adjusted the file. Subject believed to have left voluntarily. Contact confirmed by spouse. Jolene was 11. She understood only that Nadine had gone somewhere and might come back. It took years before she understood that Nadine had not gone anywhere at all, or at least not willingly, not freely, and not to any place she had chosen. 3 days after Harold Combs's funeral, Jolene returned to Calvary Fellowship and asked to speak with Patrice Sheldon. Patrice was 61. A retired school librarian who had volunteered to digitize the church's video archive after water damage in the storage closet threatened to destroy the collection. She had transferred 47 VHS tapes to DVD over the previous 8 months, cataloging each one by date, event, and any identifiable faces. She was meticulous. She had created a handwritten index on ruled paper, organized chronologically, cross-referenced by name. When Jolene explained what she had seen, Patrice did not dismiss her. She pulled the Fall Revival 1992 disc from a labeled sleeve, inserted it into the player in the church office, and found the segment. Together they watched it 4 times. Patrice slowed the playback on the 4th viewing using the DVD player's frame advance function. The image was blurry. The original VHS had been recorded on a consumer-grade camcorder in low sanctuary lighting, but the woman's face was partially visible in profile and then briefly from the front. "I don't know your sister," Patrice said carefully. "I started attending here in 2003, but I can tell you that woman isn't in any other tape I've processed." "She's only in this one?" "As far as I can tell. I've gone through recordings from 1988 to 1999. She doesn't appear in any of the regular services, holiday programs, or baptism footage. She's only in this revival clip, and the revival ran 3 nights. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. This was the Wednesday service. October 14th, 1992. Jolene stared at the frozen frame. October 1992 meant Nadine had been missing for 2.5 years. The sheriff's office had closed active efforts on the case in the summer of 1990. Dale Burkhart had filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment in January 1991 and received a default judgment because Nadine could not be located to respond. He had moved out of the Scuba Road house by March 1991 and, according to the last information Willa had gathered, relocated to Louisiana. If the woman on the tape was Nadine, she had returned to Meridian, to the very church where she was married, and sat through a Wednesday evening revival service while the entire community believed she had walked away from her life and vanished. "Can you make me a copy of this disc?" Jolene asked. Patrice hesitated. "This is church property. I'd need to ask Pastor Lundy." "Ask him." "Jolene, before I do that, you need to think about what you're actually looking at. That image is poor quality. The camera moves fast. Your mind wants it to be her." "My mind has never wanted it to be her. That's how I know." Patrice studied her for a long moment and then wrote a note to herself on the index card for the Fall Revival 1992 disc. She told Jolene she would speak to the pastor and call her within a week. Then she said something that Jolene would remember for a long time afterward. "If that is your sister, then someone in this congregation saw her that night, and nobody ever said a word." Patrice called 5 days later. Pastor Lundy had agreed to allow Jolene a personal copy of the disc, provided she signed a brief release form acknowledging the footage was church property and would not be used commercially. Jolene signed it in the church office that same afternoon and drove home with the disc in a padded envelope on her passenger seat. She did not take it to the police. She had reasons, and they were not irrational. In 1990, when the sheriff's office stopped looking for Nadine, Jolene's mother Willa had written 3 letters to the sheriff personally. Each letter described Dale Burkhart's controlling behavior, the neighbor observations, the implausibility of Nadine leaving without her car keys, and the uncorroborated phone call that Dale claimed to have received. Each letter received the same form response. The case was classified as a voluntary disappearance, and absent evidence of criminal activity, no further investigation was warranted. Willa tried again in 1996, after a co-worker at the dental clinic, Bev Osborne, came forward with a belated statement that Nadine had confided she was afraid of Dale in the weeks before she vanished. The sheriff's office reopened the case for 6 weeks, interviewed Dale in Baton Rouge by phone, and closed it again when Dale repeated his original account and no physical evidence contradicted him. Jolene had watched her mother grind herself down against institutional indifference for 20 years before Willa stopped trying, not because she accepted Nadine's absence, but because her health failed. Willa had a stroke in 2012 and now lived in an assisted care facility in Meridian, alert but physically diminished. Jolene visited 3 times a week. They almost never discussed Nadine, so Jolene did not go to the sheriff. Instead, she went to the person her instincts told her might actually help, Bev Osborne. Bev was 58 now, retired from the dental clinic, living alone in a small house on the north side of Meridian. She had known Nadine better than almost anyone outside the family. She had been a bridesmaid at the wedding. She had been the one who finally told the sheriff about Nadine's fear. And she had carried guilt for not speaking sooner for 26 years. Jolene brought the disc. She played the Fall Revival 1992 segment on Bev's television. Bev watched it twice without speaking. On the second viewing, she leaned forward and pressed her palm flat against the screen as if she could touch the blurred face. "It's not her face that gets me," Bev said. "It's her hands. Nobody held a book like that. Left hand on the spine, right hand flat. She did the same thing with charts at the office. Patrice says she doesn't appear in any other church tape. She wouldn't. One night only, in and out. That's what you'd do if you didn't want to be recognized." "Then why go to the church at all?" Bev sat back. Her expression changed, not surprise exactly, but a kind of reluctant recognition, as if she had just noticed something she had long suspected but never examined. "Because the church was the last place she was happy," Bev said. "That revival would have been her wedding anniversary month." Bev Osborne knew things about Nadine that Jolene, who had been a child when her sister disappeared, simply could not. She knew that Nadine had opened a separate savings account at Merchants and Farmers Bank 3 weeks before the wedding, a fact Nadine had mentioned casually at work, and then immediately asked Bev to forget. She knew that Nadine had asked the clinic's office manager whether accumulated vacation days could be paid out in cash rather than carried over. She knew that Nadine had photocopied her own birth certificate at the clinic's copy machine on a lunch break in early February 1990, less than a month before she vanished. None of these details had been reported to the sheriff's office. The savings account was mentioned in Bev's 1996 statement, but a deputy who contacted Merchants and Farmers was told the account had been closed in April 1990, 1 month after Nadine's disappearance, and the remaining balance of $214 had been withdrawn in person by the account holder. The bank could not provide identification records for the withdrawal because their policy in 1990 did not require photo identification for in-person transactions on accounts below a certain threshold. "Someone walked into that bank and closed Nadine's account after she was already gone," Jolene said. "Or Nadine walked in herself," Bev said, "if she was still in the area." The withdrawal was April 1990. She was reported missing in March. Missing doesn't mean gone, Jolene. Missing means nobody who was looking could find her. That's a different thing. This distinction settled into Jolene like a stone dropping into water. Her working theory, the family's working theory for 27 years, had been that Dale did something to Nadine, and the system failed to investigate. The church video, if it really showed Nadine alive in October 1992, didn't just challenge that theory, it obliterated it. but it replaced the old horror with a new one. If Nadine was alive in 1992, sitting in a church pew in Meridian, then she was not kidnapped, she was not killed, and she did not lose her memory. She had chosen to stay hidden, from Dale, perhaps, but also from Willa, from Jolene, from Bev, from everyone who had spent years in anguish. Jolene called Patrice that evening and asked whether the church kept membership records from the early 1990s. Patrice said the current records were computerized, but older records existed in paper form, index cards filed alphabetically in a metal cabinet in the church office. Jolene asked whether she could look through them. "What are you looking for?" Patrice asked. "A name I don't recognize that started appearing around 1992. The next morning, Patrice met Jolene at the church. The metal cabinet held cards dating from 1971 to 2004. Each card recorded a name, address, phone number, date of first attendance, and whether the person had been baptized at Calvary. Jolene started at 1992 and worked forward. In 40 minutes, she had identified 8 new members who joined between September 1992 and March 1993. 6 were men. 1 was a married couple who had transferred from a Baptist church in Jackson. The 8th card bore the name Corinne Ballard, with a Meridian address, no phone number, and a first attendance date of October 12, 1992, 2 days before the Fall Revival Wednesday service. The card was filled out in handwriting that Jolene did not recognize, but beneath the printed name, in the space labeled Previous Church, someone had written in different ink, "None given." The address on Corinne Ballard's membership card was 1614 Poplar Springs Road, Meridian. Jolene drove there that afternoon. The house was a small, single-story structure with a chain-link fence around the front yard and a carport on the left side. It was clearly occupied. A child's bicycle leaned against the fence, and a pickup truck sat in the carport, but it did not look like a place where the same person had lived for 24 years. Jolene knocked. A man in his 40s opened the door. She introduced herself and asked how long he had been living there. He said he and his wife had purchased the house in 2009 from a landlord who owned several rental properties in the area. Before that, he had no idea who had lived there. He offered the landlord's name, Vernon Stokes. Jolene found Vernon Stokes listed in the county property records at the Lauderdale County Courthouse. He still owned 11 residential rental properties. His office was in a converted storefront on 5th Street. She walked in without an appointment. Vernon Stokes was 73, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a desk buried under lease agreements. When Jolene asked about 1614 Poplar Springs Road and a tenant named Corinne Ballard, he squinted and pulled a battered filing cabinet drawer open. His records were organized by property address, and he kept paper files going back to the mid-1980s. Ballard, he muttered, thumbing through folders. He stopped. "Here, Corinne Ballard. Leased from October 1992 to August 1994. Paid in cash every month. No bounce checks because there were no checks. She put bills in an envelope and pushed it through the mail slot in this door." "Did you ever meet her?" "Once, when she signed the lease. She was a quiet woman, thin, didn't want to talk. I figured she was coming out of a bad situation." "Why did you think that?" "Because she paid 3 months up front in cash, she didn't have references, and she flinched when I stood up too fast." Jolene asked whether he had a copy of the lease. He did. He pulled it from the file. A single-page standard rental agreement, handwritten, dated October 6, 1992. The tenant's signature read, "Corinne Ballard," in small, controlled handwriting. Jolene looked at the signature for a long time. She had seen Nadine's handwriting in birthday cards, in notes left on the kitchen counter, in a journal Nadine had kept as a teenager. This handwriting was similar in certain letter formations, the lowercase e the way the L looped, but it was not identical. It was as if someone had practiced writing differently and almost succeeded. "Was she alone?" Jolene asked. "As far as I knew, one person on the lease, never saw anybody else coming or going. She kept the place clean, paid on time, and left without any damage. That's all a landlord really knows." "Where did she go when the lease ended?" Vernon shrugged. "Didn't say. Didn't leave a forwarding address. Just put August rent in the slot with a note that said she'd be out by the 30th. Jolene thanked him and left. She sat in her car for a long time. Corinne Ballard had arrived in Meridian in October 1992, rented a house with cash, attended Calvary Fellowship once or twice, and lived quietly for nearly 2 years before disappearing again. If Corinne Ballard was Nadine, then Nadine had been less than 6 miles from her mother's house for almost 2 years. And if Corinne Ballard was not Nadine, then Jolene was chasing a coincidence through paperwork and blurred video footage, and her mother had been right to say don't. Jolene spent the next 3 weeks trying to find any trace of Corinne Ballard in Meridian beyond the church card and the lease. She checked the local phone directories archived at the public library. Corinne Ballard was not listed in 1992, 1993, or 1994. She visited the Lauderdale County Tax Assessor's office and found no property records under that name. She searched newspaper archives for any mention. Nothing. She called the dental clinic where Nadine had worked and asked the current office manager whether anyone named Corinne Ballard had ever been a patient. The records from that period had been purged during a system conversion in 2001. Corinne Ballard had lived in Meridian for 2 years and left almost no public trace. But she had left one trace that nobody had thought to examine: the church membership card. Patrice Sheldon had been cataloging the archive systematically, and she told Jolene that membership cards from the early 1990s sometimes had a second notation: a small mark in the upper right corner indicating whether the person had attended a welcome dinner for new members. Corinne Ballard's card had that mark. "There was a welcome dinner in November 1992, Patrice said. "I know because I found the planning sheet in the files. It lists the new members who attended." Patrice produced the planning sheet. It was a half-page of handwritten notes listing 6 names, including Corinne B. Beside each name was the name of the church member assigned to sit with them as a host. Beside Corinne B was the name Helen Greer. Helen Greer was still alive. She was 84 years old and living in a retirement apartment complex in Meridian. She had been a member of Calvary Fellowship for 50 years and had served on the hospitality committee for most of them. Jolene called her, explained that she was researching family history and had found her name connected to a church event from 1992, and asked whether Helen remembered a new member named Corinne Ballard. Helen's pause lasted long enough to tell Jolene something important. "That was a long time ago," Helen said carefully. "I know. I'm trying to find out anything I can about her." "May I ask why?" Jolene chose honesty. "I think Corinne Ballard might be my sister Nadine. Nadine disappeared in 1990. I found her, or someone who looks exactly like her, in a church video from the 1992 revival." Helen was quiet again. Then she said, "Come see me tomorrow. I'd rather talk about this in person." The next afternoon, Jolene sat in Helen Greer's small living room, surrounded by framed photographs of grandchildren and shelves of porcelain figurines. Helen served instant coffee in mismatched mugs and sat across from Jolene with her hands folded. "I remember Corinne," Helen said. "I remember her because she scared me." "Scared you?" "Not in a dangerous way. Scared me because I could see she was running from something, and I didn't know whether the Christian thing to do was help her hide or help her get found." Helen described Corinne Ballard as a slender woman in her late 20s with dark auburn hair, quiet, polite, and visibly nervous. She came to the welcome dinner alone. She ate very little. She answered Helen's questions with short, rehearsed-sounding responses. She was from out of state. She had recently moved to Meridian for work. She did not have family in the area. When Helen asked what kind of work she did, Corinne said she cleaned houses. When Helen offered to introduce her to other members, Corinne said she preferred to keep to herself for now. "After the dinner, I saw her in church maybe 2 or 3 more times," Helen said. "Always sitting in the back. Always leaving before the service ended. Then she stopped coming entirely." Helen Greer had not told Jolene everything in that first sitting. The older woman paused after describing Corinne's church attendance and looked toward the window, and Jolene recognized the expression. It was the face of someone deciding how much truth a conversation could bear. "Helen," Jolene said, "if you know something about my sister, I need you to tell me." Helen opened a drawer in the side table beside her chair and removed a small envelope. It was unsealed, slightly yellowed. She held it for a moment before passing it across. "Corinne gave me this the last time I saw her," Helen said. "She came to my house, not to church. It was sometime in the summer of 1994. She stood on my porch and handed me this envelope and asked me to hold it. She said if anyone ever came asking about her, I should give it to them. She said if nobody ever came, I should throw it away." "And nobody came until now?" "Nobody came until now." Jolene opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card, the same kind used for church membership, and on it, in the same controlled handwriting from the lease, was written, "My real name is Nadine Pryor Burkhart. I am not dead. I left because staying would have killed me. I cannot explain more than this. If my sister Jolene is the one reading this, please know that I am sorry and that nothing that happened was your fault. N." Jolene read it 3 times. Her hands were steady. Her vision blurred at the edges, but she did not cry. Not yet. Not in front of this woman she barely knew. She folded the card back into the envelope and pressed it flat against her knee. "You've had this for 22 years, Jolene said. "Yes. And you never contacted my family. She asked me not to. She asked me to wait until someone came looking. I didn't know your family. I didn't know who to trust. I was 60 years old and a woman I barely knew put a secret in my hands and walked away. I didn't know if the husband was the danger or the family was the danger or something else entirely. I kept the envelope. I prayed about it. And I waited." Jolene could feel anger pressing against the edges of her composure. Anger that this stranger had held proof of Nadine's survival while Willa spent decades in torment. But she also understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that Helen Greer had been placed in an impossible position by a frightened woman she met at a church dinner, and that the weight of that envelope had probably haunted Helen far more than she would ever say. "Do you know where she went when she left Meridian?" "No, she didn't tell me. She said the less I knew, the safer it would be for both of us." "Safer from Dale?" Helen looked directly at Jolene. "She never said his name, but when I asked if the person she was running from might come to the church looking for her, she said, 'He already knows where every church in Lauderdale County is. That's why I can't stay.'" Jolene brought the index card to Bev Osborne's house that evening. Bev read it in the kitchen under the fluorescent ceiling light, and when she finished, she set it on the counter and covered it with her palm as if to keep it from blowing away in a non-existent wind. "She was alive," Bev said. "In 1994 at least. She was alive, and she came back to Meridian and she sat in that church, and nobody knew." "Somebody knew," Jolene said. "Helen Greer knew, she just didn't know what to do about it." Bev leaned against the counter. Her face worked through several emotions before settling on something Jolene did not expect: shame. "I have to tell you something," Bev said. "I should have told you before you started any of this, but I didn't think it still mattered, and now I can see it does." Bev explained. In January 1990, 2 months before Nadine was reported missing, Nadine had come to Bev's house late on a weeknight, visibly frightened, with a bruise on her left wrist that she made no effort to hide. She told Bev that Dale had become unpredictable. She said the violence had escalated from shoving to striking, and that 2 nights earlier he had held her arm against the stove burner until she agreed to cancel a planned visit to her mother's house. She showed Bev a burn scar that was still healing. Nadine asked Bev for help. Specifically, she asked Bev whether she could borrow Bev's cousin's address in Biloxi as a forwarding destination for certain mail, a new identification card she had applied for under an alternate name. Bev asked what name. Nadine said Corinne Ballard. "She told me she'd found the name in an old obituary at the library," Bev said. "A woman named Corinne Ballard who was born in 1964, the same year as Nadine, and died as an infant. Nadine sent away for a copy of the birth certificate. She was building a second identity so she could leave Dale without him being able to find her." "And you helped her?" "I gave her the address. My cousin received the documents and mailed them to a P.O. box Nadine had opened in Hattiesburg. I didn't know the box number. I didn't ask." "Bev, you've known since 1990 that my sister planned to leave and change her name, and you never told my mother. You never told me." Bev's voice cracked. "She begged me not to. She said if Willa knew, Willa would confront Dale and Dale would know Nadine was planning to run and it would get worse. She said the only way it worked was if everyone, including family, believed she was gone without a plan. She said the surprise was the only protection she had." Jolene stood in Bev's kitchen and felt the architecture of 27 years rearrange itself. Her mother's agony, the letters to the sheriff, the assumptions about murder, the years of mourning. All of it had occurred inside a silence that Bev had chosen to maintain. And Nadine had asked her to. Nadine had designed the silence. The cruelty was not Dale's alone, it was woven into the escape itself, because the escape required the people who loved Nadine most to believe she might be dead. "I have one more question," Jolene said. "Did you know she came back to Meridian in 1992? "No, I swear I didn't. After she disappeared, I never heard from her again. Jolene now held 3 facts that the sheriff's office had never possessed. Nadine had created a false identity before she disappeared. She had lived in Meridian under that identity for nearly 2 years. And she had left a written confirmation of her real name with a church member in 1994. Each of these facts pointed toward a voluntary disappearance. None of them explained where Nadine had gone after August 1994, or whether she was still alive in 2016. Jolene considered going to the police. The old case file was presumably still in storage at the sheriff's office, and the written confirmation of identity might be enough to trigger a reopening. But Jolene had learned something from her mother's experience. Institutions responded to evidence, not emotion, and the kind of evidence they responded to was the kind that moved through their systems: database hits, financial records, addresses linked to Social Security numbers. She hired a private investigator. His name was Glenn Chaney, a former insurance fraud examiner in Jackson who now ran a one-person skip-tracing operation. He was not dramatic, not expensive, and not interested in the emotional dimensions of the case. He asked for 2 things: the name Corinne Ballard and Nadine's Social Security number, which Jolene obtained from Willa's old files in the assisted living facility. Glenn returned results within 8 days. Nadine's Social Security number had been inactive since March 1990. No employment filings, no tax returns, no benefit claims. It was consistent with a person who had either died or permanently abandoned their legal identity. The name Corinne Ballard, paired with the infant birth certificate Nadine had obtained, was more complicated. Glenn found a Social Security number issued to Corinne Ballard in 1964, shortly after birth, which had been flagged as a deceased infant's number in federal records. But someone had used that number to file employment taxes in Mississippi from 1993 to 1994, and then in Tennessee from 1995 to 2003. After 2003, the number went dormant. No employment, no tax filings, no benefit claims. Either she stopped working, Glenn said, or she switched to a third identity. Can you tell where in Tennessee? The employer filings from 1995 to 2003 list a business called Orchard Hill Senior Care in Clarksville, Tennessee. It's a residential assisted living facility, still operating. Jolene sat in Glenn's cramped office and stared at the printout. Nadine, if Corinne Ballard was Nadine, had worked at a senior care facility in Clarksville, Tennessee, for 8 years. She had been there while Willa wrote letters to the sheriff. She had been there while Jolene graduated high school, attended community college, started a career, got married, got divorced. She had been less than 400 miles away, working under a stolen name, cleaning rooms or spooning meals for other people's aging parents while her own mother suffered a stroke and moved into a facility not unlike the one she worked in. Glenn cautioned her. This doesn't confirm identity. It confirms someone used that name and number. It could be anyone who got hold of the same birth certificate. It's not anyone, Jolene said. I have the handwritten note. The handwriting is close enough to Nadine's to match. The physical description from the landlord and the church member match, and the woman in the church video looks exactly like my sister. Then the question isn't whether it's her, Glenn said. The question is why the number went dark in 2003. Jolene drove to Clarksville, Tennessee, on a gray Tuesday morning in November 2016. The drive took 5.5 hours. She did not call ahead. She did not know what she would say when she arrived. She brought the disc, the index card in its envelope, and a photograph of Nadine from the 1989 wedding, the only clear photograph she possessed. Orchard Hill Senior Care occupied a single-story brick building on a quiet road east of downtown Clarksville. The parking lot was half full. A receptionist behind a glass window asked if she was visiting a resident. Jolene said she was looking for information about a former employee. We can't give out personnel information, the receptionist said. I understand. I'm not looking for records. I'm trying to locate a woman who may have worked here under the name Corinne Ballard, probably between 1995 and 2003. The receptionist frowned and picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she directed Jolene to wait. A few minutes later, a woman in her 50s emerged from a back office. She introduced herself as Marguerite Henson, the facility's administrator. Marguerite led Jolene to a small conference room. She listened to a condensed version of the story. missing sister, church video, handwritten note, social security records, with the professional neutrality of someone accustomed to emotional conversations. When Jolene finished, Marguerite folded her hands on the table. "I've been the administrator here since 2001, she said. "I can't share employment files without a legal request, but I can tell you off the record that the name Corinne Ballard is familiar to me. She was a care aide here, she was well liked by the residents, she left in the summer of 2003. "Why did she leave? "She gave 2 weeks' notice and said she was relocating, she didn't say where. "Was there anything unusual about her departure?" Marguerite hesitated. The hesitation lasted several seconds, long enough for Jolene to understand that there was something, and that Marguerite was weighing whether to share it outside the protection of official procedure. "There was a man," Marguerite said. "About a month before Corinne left, a man came to the facility and asked the receptionist whether Corinne Ballard worked here. The receptionist said she couldn't confirm employee information. The man left, but one of our CNAs saw him sitting in the parking lot for over an hour after that. She described him to Corinne. Corinne turned white, left the building through the back entrance, and called in sick for the next 3 days. "Did anyone report the man?" "Corinne asked us not to. She said it was a personal matter. 2 weeks later she gave notice." "Did anyone describe what he looked like?" "I wasn't here at the time, but the CNA's account is in our incident log because the receptionist filed a report about the parking lot loitering. The notation says, 'White male, late 30s, medium build, brown hair, driving a dark-colored pickup truck with Louisiana plates.'" Dale Burkhart had moved to Louisiana in 1991. Jolene returned to Meridian with a clear and terrible understanding. Dale Burkhart had never stopped looking for Nadine. The voluntary disappearance theory, the default divorce, the move to Louisiana, none of it meant what the sheriff's office had assumed. Dale had not moved on. He had relocated to a place where he could rebuild his life on the surface while continuing to search for the woman who had escaped him. Jolene now went to the sheriff's office. She brought everything: the church video disc, the index card in Helen Greer's envelope, the lease from Vernon Stokes, the social security trace from Glenn Chaney, and the Orchard Hill incident report that Marguerite Henson had printed for her. Redacted but legible. She requested a meeting with the current sheriff, a man named Roy Dillard, who had taken office in 2014 and had no connection to the original investigation. Sheriff Dillard listened. He reviewed the materials. He asked questions that demonstrated he understood the implications. A woman who had been classified as a voluntary missing person in 1990 had, in fact, been fleeing documented domestic violence. She had created a false identity, lived under it for over a decade, and then fled again when her abuser apparently located her, and her current whereabouts were unknown. Dillard made 2 calls. The first was to the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. The second was to the Clarksville Police Department in Tennessee. Within a week, an MBI investigator named Althea Rawlings was assigned to the case. Her mandate was narrow: determine whether Nadine Pryor Burkhart was alive, and determine whether Dale Burkhart represented an ongoing threat. Investigator Rawlings obtained a subpoena for Dale Burkhart's current address through Louisiana DMV records. He was living in Gonzales, Louisiana, 30 miles south of Baton Rouge. He was employed as a maintenance supervisor at a commercial real estate company. He had remarried in 1996. His second wife's name was Donna. They had 1 child, a son, age 18. Rawlings also obtained a broader trace on the Corinne Ballard's Social Security number. After 2003, the number had indeed gone dormant, but in 2005, a change of address form had been filed with the Social Security Administration, linking the number to a residential address in Whiteville, Tennessee, a small town an hour-and-a-half northeast of Memphis. No employment filings followed, no benefit claims. Just the address change, which had never been flagged because the infant death record had not been cross-referenced in the SSA's system until a 2011 audit, and even then the discrepancy was noted but never investigated. The Whiteville address was a rural property, 3 acres, a small farmhouse, no mortgage. The property was owned by a woman named June Odom. Rawlings checked the deed records. June Odom had purchased the property in 2004. She was listed as a single woman, age 40, born in Hardeman County, Tennessee, but June Odom had no birth certificate on file with the state of Tennessee. Her driver's license, issued in 2005, listed her date of birth as April 22, 1964, the same birthday as Nadine Pryor. Investigator Rawlings drove to Whiteville on a December morning with instructions from her supervisor to make contact and assess the situation without creating additional risk. She went alone. She wore plain clothes. She parked at the end of the gravel driveway and walked toward the farmhouse. The property was maintained but not manicured, a vegetable garden along the south side, a chicken coop near the tree line, firewood stacked under a tarp beside the carport. A gray sedan was parked under the carport. The house had been recently painted. Curtains covered every window. Rawlings knocked on the front door. She waited. She knocked again. After nearly a minute, the curtain on the window beside the door moved, and a woman's face appeared briefly before the curtain fell back. The door opened part way. The woman standing in the gap was in her early 50s. She was thin. Her hair, once dark auburn, was threaded heavily with gray and cut short. She wore no jewelry. She looked at Rawlings with an expression that was not fear exactly, but the alertness of someone who had spent decades calibrating the distance between herself and the rest of the world. "June Odom?" Rawlings said. "Who's asking?" Rawlings identified herself and explained that she was investigating a missing persons case from Mississippi. The woman's hand tightened on the doorframe. "I don't know anything about a missing person," she said. "The missing person's name is Nadine Pryor Burkhart. She disappeared in 1990. Her sister recently found evidence suggesting she may have changed her name and relocated. I'm not here to create problems. I'm here to determine whether Ms. Burkhart is alive and safe." The woman looked at Rawlings for a long time. Behind her, the house was dim and silent. There was no sound of a television, no radio, no other person moving. She lived alone. The garden, the chickens, the firewood, all of it was scaled for one. "If she was alive," the woman said slowly, "and if she was safe, would that be enough?" "Enough for what? Enough for you to leave?" Rawlings understood the negotiation embedded in the question, and she answered honestly, "I can't make that decision alone. Your sister filed no formal complaint, but the MBI is now involved because the original case was never properly resolved and there may be a continuing threat. If you're Nadine Burkhart, I need to hear it from you directly so I can close the case correctly, and I need to assess whether Dale Burkhart poses a current danger." The woman closed her eyes. She pressed her forehead against the edge of the door, and then she stepped back and opened it wider. "Come in," she said, "and close the door behind you." The farmhouse was sparse and clean. A wood stove heated the front room. The kitchen had a small table with one chair. The bookshelves held paperbacks, mysteries, gardening manuals, a Bible. There were no photographs on the walls, not one. The only decoration was a single piece of needlework in a plain frame above the wood stove. It read in small cross-stitched letters, "Be still." The woman sat at the kitchen table. Rawlings sat across from her. And for the first time in 27 years, the woman who had been calling herself June Odom said her real name out loud. "My name is Nadine Pryor Burkhart," she said. "I left because he would have killed me, and I stayed gone because he never stopped looking." Nadine's account was not the story of a woman who had run once and found freedom. It was the story of a woman who had run 4 times. The first time was March 2nd, 1990, the night before Dale reported her missing. She had packed the leather suitcase with clothes, the Corinne Ballard identification documents, and $400 in cash she had gradually withdrawn from the separate savings account. She drove to the Hattiesburg P.O. box, retrieved additional documents she had mailed to herself, and then abandoned her car at a rest stop south of Meridian, where a cleaning woman from the dental clinic's building, a woman Bev Osborne had quietly connected her with, picked her up and drove her to a Greyhound station in Laurel. She bought a ticket to Mobile. In Mobile, she bought a second ticket to Atlanta. In Atlanta, she stayed in a shelter for 11 days before returning to Mississippi. She came back because she had nowhere else to go. The identity she had built was fragile. She had no employment history under Corinne Ballard's name, no references, no credit. She was a woman without a past, and in 1990, before widespread digital records, that meant she was also a woman without a future. The shelters could offer temporary beds but not permanent identities. The organization she contacted could help with protective orders, which required using her real name and entering a court system Dale's friends in Lauderdale County might access. She returned to Meridian in late 1992 because it was the only place she knew how to survive. She rented the house on Poplar Springs Road from Vernon Stokes, paying cash she had earned cleaning houses in Atlanta and Birmingham over the preceding 2 years. She attended Calvary Fellowship briefly because she was desperately lonely and because, as Bev had guessed, the church was the last place she associated with happiness. She left the note with Helen Greer in 1994 because she had begun to feel exposed. A neighbor on Poplar Springs Road had recognized her in the grocery store and called her by the wrong name. "Aren't you Willa Pryor's girl?" And Nadine had denied it and moved on, but the encounter shattered her sense of safety. The second flight took her to Clarksville, Tennessee, where she worked at Orchard Hill for 8 years, the longest period of stability in her adult life. She had friends, she had a routine, she had a small apartment with a cat. Then Dale's figure appeared in the parking lot, and everything collapsed again. The third flight, in 2003, brought her briefly to Nashville, then to a women's shelter in Memphis, and finally to Whiteville, where she used money saved from 8 years of work to buy the farmhouse under a third assumed name, June Odom. She assembled this identity from a different deceased person's records, a process that had become easier with practice and more painful with each repetition. The fourth flight never happened. She stayed in Whiteville. She raised chickens and grew tomatoes and read mystery novels and waited for the knock that she always knew would eventually come. "I kept expecting Dale," she told Rawlings. "I thought if the door ever opened it would be him." "Are you sorry it was me instead?" Nadine looked toward the needlework on the wall. "I don't know yet." Investigator Rawlings returned to Meridian and briefed Sheriff Dillard. The legal situation was intricate. Nadine was alive and competent. She had committed identity fraud, using a deceased infant's birth certificate, filing employment taxes under false Social Security numbers, purchasing property under a fabricated name. But every act had been committed in the context of fleeing documented domestic violence. The district attorney's office reviewed the facts and declined to pursue charges, citing prosecutorial discretion and the absence of financial victims. The Social Security Administration flagged the fraudulent numbers for administrative closure but took no criminal referral. Dale Burkhart was a different matter. Rawlings and the MBI coordinated with Louisiana authorities to examine whether Dale had engaged in stalking across state lines. The parking lot incident at Orchard Hill in 2003 was circumstantial but consistent with surveillance. Rawlings subpoenaed Dale's employer travel records and credit card statements from 2001 to 2004. They showed fuel purchases along Interstate 24 toward Clarksville on 3 separate occasions in 2003, including the week the receptionist had logged the parking lot loiterer. Dale had no professional reason to travel to Tennessee. The Gonzales Police Department in Louisiana interviewed Dale at his home. He denied knowing anyone named Corinne Ballard. He denied traveling to Clarksville. When confronted with the credit card records, he ended the interview and retained an attorney. No criminal charges were filed. The evidence supported a pattern but did not meet the threshold for a stalking prosecution under either Mississippi or Tennessee law without direct victim testimony, and Nadine refused to testify. Jolene was given Nadine's address by Rawlings, with Nadine's consent. Rawlings made it clear that Nadine had agreed to the disclosure reluctantly and had set conditions. Jolene could write a letter. If Nadine chose to respond, contact would proceed on Nadine's terms. If Nadine did not respond, Jolene would not visit unannounced. Jolene wrote the letter that evening. It took her 6 hours. She wrote and discarded 11 drafts. The final version was 1 page. She did not reproach Nadine for the silence. She did not describe their mother's suffering. She did not ask why. She wrote about what she remembered. Nadine teaching her to braid hair in the backyard, Nadine letting her wear the white dress-up gloves before the wedding, the way Nadine smelled like the mint toothpaste samples she brought home from the dental clinic. She wrote, "I am not coming to take you back to anything. I just needed to know you were still in the world." She mailed it. She waited. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. It was written on lined notebook paper in the same controlled handwriting from the lease and the index card, though looser now, less guarded. Nadine thanked her for the letter. She said she had thought about Jolene every single day. She said she could not explain 27 years of silence in a letter and did not intend to try. She said she was healthy, she was alone by choice, and she was not the person Jolene remembered. She said she had become someone who lived inside a very small perimeter, and that perimeter was the only thing that had kept her alive. At the bottom, she had written a phone number. Jolene called it on a Sunday evening in January 2017. Nadine answered on the second ring. Neither of them spoke for almost 15 seconds. Then Nadine said, "I kept thinking you'd give up looking." "I didn't look," Jolene said. "Not until the video. I thought you were dead, Nadine. For 27 years I thought you were dead." "Part of me was," Nadine said. "The part that knew how to be your sister. I don't know if she comes back. She doesn't have to. I just needed the part that answers the phone." They talked for 40 minutes. They did not discuss Dale. They did not discuss Willa. They discussed the weather in Whiteville and the weather in Meridian, and whether Nadine's chickens had names and whether Jolene still worked at the insurance office. The conversation was small and careful and full of pauses, and when it ended, Jolene sat on her kitchen floor and wept in a way she had not wept since childhood. Not from grief, but from the violent, disorienting relief of a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. She drove to the assisted living facility the next morning. Willa was in her chair by the window, watching birds at the feeder outside. Jolene sat beside her and took her hand. "Mama," she said, "Nadine is alive." Willa did not react for several seconds. Then she turned her head and looked at Jolene with an expression that contained no surprise, not because she had known but because she had refused, with the full irrational stubbornness of a mother's conviction, to ever completely believe otherwise. "Where?" Willa said. "Tennessee, she's safe. She's been safe for a while now." Willa closed her eyes. Her hand tightened around Jolene's. Her lips moved, but no words came, just the breath of a woman finally setting down something she had held for 27 years. 3 months later, Nadine drove to Meridian. She did not visit the church. She did not visit the house on Scuba Road. She drove directly to the assisted living facility and walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway of her mother's room, while Willa stared at her from the chair by the window. Neither of them moved. The distance between the doorway and the chair was perhaps 10 feet, and it contained everything. Every silent year, every unanswered prayer, every morning Willa had opened her eyes and not known whether her daughter was alive or buried in some unmarked place. Nadine crossed it. She knelt beside the chair. Willa put both hands on her daughter's face and held it, and the sound she made was not a word in any language but was understood by every person who heard it through the open door. Jolene stood in the hallway and let them have it. She leaned against the wall and breathed. Through the window at the end of the corridor, the winter light fell across the floor in long, pale rectangles, and somewhere in the building a radio played something she almost recognized, and the world, ordinary, damaged, ordinary, continued on the other side of the glass.